Hello and welcome to AFL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on aflnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello, our listeners. Today we have a Washington expert on Turkey affairs, Ms. Merve Tahiroglu, who is a research analyst at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Merve has written a recent column for The Hill in which she touched several important issues in the same piece. But in its center, Merve discussed how Turkey's ongoing realignment with Russia would cost the country. Merve, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
My first question, first of all, it's very good piece, and you basically put the hottest topics in the same column. And one part of it came to me very interesting. You are saying that the costs of Turkey's ongoing shift to Russia actually much larger, but Turkish leaders are basically don't admit that. Can you please tell the listeners what are those costs?
Yes, of course. The problem is that we can start this discussion based on Turkey's intent to purchase the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. So everything in my piece and much of the conversation in Washington today is pegged to the S-400. But what I argue is that the S-400 has become a bigger deal. It signals to Washington that Turkey is making a broader strategic shift from the NATO orbit towards the Russian orbit. So while Ankara might see its purchase of the S-400 as just a defense procurement issue, from Washington, it's a much bigger issue signaling this broader shift. And some of those costs, at least the ones that I've looked at, is we've been talking about the major costs of the S-400 for Turkey's defense system, namely that this deal could very well come at the expense of Turkey's participation in the F-35 program, which would have its own costs on Turkey. Turkey not only already invested, I believe, something like $1.5 million into it. Lockheed Martin calculates that it stands to benefit around $12 billion from the program itself, because Turkey is very much involved in the co-production process of the F-35. So if Turkey purchases the S-400 and as a result of that loses its participation in the F-35, it's looking to not only forfeit the $1 billion it already invested in it, but also the up to $12 billion benefits that it currently stands to reap from that program. In addition to that, there's also the issue of CAATSA sanctions in Washington, which basically says that the S-400 deal, because it involves making a deal with the Russian defense sector, could trigger sanctions on Turkey, and those sanctions could also could tally up to multi-billion dollars itself. What I specifically mention in this piece is that beyond those costs for Turkey's defense sector, there are also important political costs that could come at the expense of Turkey's energy industry. As we know, Turkey's energy is very much dependent on Russia, especially with regards to Turkey's natural gas imports. So it's very important for Turkey to achieve any kind of energy independence is to partake in these multiple gas explorations and gas deals that are taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. And what we're seeing is that Washington is increasingly willing to sideline Turkey from that entire from those activities that are taking place between countries like Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt. all of which have right now difficult political ties with Turkey. So while America could actually play an important role in bringing Turkey back into the fold in this Eastern Mediterranean, what we're seeing with recently introduced legislation is that the United States might actually decide not to pursue engaging Turkey back into the East Mediterranean per this legislation.
Let me jump in. Actually, you already addressed some of my questions. So you are arguing that due to this S-400 purchase, let me ask this way. Let's say tomorrow or next month, Turkey changes its mind and decides not to purchase this S-400. Do you think this issue by itself can solve all other issues, or Turkey has to do more?
It would go a long way, because I think it would signal to Washington, if Turkey dropped the S-400s, it would signal to Washington that Turkey is not yet ready to realign itself fully with Russia. But I mean, what your question leads me to say is that Turkey's closer cooperation with Russia has been ongoing for a number of years, and there's the rapprochement that we see, the increasingly closer ties between Turkey and Russia, but also in parallel to that, Turkey is trying to move away from NATO as well. So while Ankara might try to justify this, saying we're simply trying to balance the regional powers and our interests accordingly, and we would like to be less reliant on NATO and the NATO orbit, both in the energy sector and the defense sector and politically, from Washington's perspective, given the global dynamics at play right now, it's looking like Turkey is moving towards the Russian orbit. So that entire movement and that entire shift is not going to go away with the S-400s, but the S-400s are a major part of these calculations.
I understand. So in recent days, we heard that President Trump might be coming to Turkey. I was unable to confirm this with the US officials. But where do you put this visit in this context? Do you think it is possible? And my final question, let me put together and then we can close this. You stated this, and I think many other analysts also talking about this, tens of billions of cost is not only shifting, but as recent as yesterday, Turkish Defense Minister again stated that Turkey is going to get F-35s and also Turkey is going to get S-400s, not a big deal kind of approach. So Turkish officials do not understand it, or they continue to just downplay the situation?
So Turkey has been, over the last few weeks, intensely lobbying the White House to give a sanctions waiver on this CATSA program, which is, as I said, is separate from the F-35 issue. But this shows us that Turkey believes not only that it can buy the S-400s, not get sanctioned under CATSA, and continue to also participate in the F-35. So essentially not get an additional sanction by the United States to remove it from the F-35 program. And while they're engaged in this intense lobbying, it's really hard to see how Turkey can get out of the current conundrum that it's in, because there is legislation in place, and we're looking at a Congress that is very frustrated with Turkey. It has been increasingly frustrated with Turkey. So even if Erdogan, as he counts on his personal relationship with President Trump to kind of override Congress, it's not clear to me that they actually will be able to do it. Because I think part of the confusion in Ankara is looking at the United States, is understanding the US domestic politics and the political landscape here. Congress is very much an independent actor when we look at American foreign policy, whereas in Turkish foreign policy, especially today, it's really one man making the decisions, which is President Erdogan himself. And so it might be hard from Ankara looking at Washington to see that President Trump is not the sole decision maker when it comes to American foreign policy and when it comes to American policy towards Turkey. But that is very much the reality. And Turkey is facing multiple counterparts in Washington. I believe when we look at the way Turkey has been lobbying the US administration, it seems to be ignoring this major elephant in the room, which is Congress. And I don't believe that problem is going to go away, although getting past this S-400, F-35 and sanctions issue could very much help. And the key thing here is that I can't make any predictions as to what's going to happen, but all I can say is the deadline is soon approaching because the S-400s are expected to be delivered to Turkey in July. So we're looking at a very narrow timeline, and the next few months are going to be crucial. Of course, it's also important to mention here that Turkey and the US have multiple problems in their bilateral relationships. There's also intense negotiations concerning the Turkish demands for a safe zone in northern Syria. There's also discussions regarding American sanctions on Iranian oil and Turkey's dependency on Iranian oil, and whether Turkey can actually reduce its imports or end its oil imports completely from Iran within the next 6 months. So I believe all of these are parts of the same negotiations, and Turkey is intensely lobbying for its interests here, but it has put itself in a very difficult box to get out of, and the S-400s is the key point in this.
And what is this Trump visit speculations then? Can he come to Turkey under the circumstances?
Well, I think he can come to Turkey in July, but it would be a very awkward situation if the S-400s are there and there's not been any decision made with regards to the F-35, because whether Trump visits or not, we're essentially looking at a summer of complete confusion over the S-400 and the F-35. So there's going to be hard decisions made in the next few months, and we're all going to watch. But I think that Turkey is looking at the important thing to note here is that Turkey is looking to foot higher costs than I think it can afford at this point, given the status of its economy and given its foreign relations with the rest of the Western Bloc.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on today. We have Merve Tahiroglu today, and we discussed her latest piece at The Hill about the cost of Turkey's ongoing shift to Russia orbit. Thanks again for coming on.
Many thanks, Ilhan.